This is the Liberal Europe podcast by ELF, bringing liberal ideas into the political debate, with Leszek Jazdzewski and Ricardo Silvestre.
Hello, welcome to Liberal Europe. This is Leszek Jazdzewski, and today we're going to discuss the issue of the green policy, green transformation, and climate policy, and ahead of Freedom Games. And this is why I invited a great expert from ECFR, Susi Dennison, who is a Senior Director for Talent and Transformation and a Senior Policy Fellow at the ECFR, and the author of the recent report, The Power of Partnerships, European Climate Leadership with Less America. Susi, welcome to Liberal Europe.
Thank you very much for having me.
So this is the question of the panel. You'll be taking part at the Freedom Games. Can we build consensus on climate policy? Can we?
Within the European Union, we're thinking here.
Well, that's a very good question. I don't know if there has ever been consensus, but do you think it could go further than just those 8% emitting EU? Do you think this is possible to rebuild it on the world scale, perhaps?
Okay, so maybe we can take the question on a number of different levels, because I think that fundamentally what makes this such a difficult area at the moment within European societies, but also on the global stage more broadly, is that the sense of fear and uncertainty and insecurity around the warming planet has not dissipated. The increasing evidence of the costs of climate change are becoming apparent in Europe, with more frequent weather-related disasters, with more frequent floods, heat waves making the climate of different regions more complicated in certain years. And this is no longer a sort of a one-off phenomenon that countries sort of see every 5 years, but rather becoming a regular dynamic in the European year. And we are seeing estimates. A recent report came out from the ECB and the University of Mannheim this week, which was putting the estimates of climate-related extreme weather events at being 43 billion euros this year alone. And so the sense that this is now upon us, this is no longer a question of planning for the future, is very much there for all Europeans. But the divisive factor is that I think that since the European Union committed to the European Green Deal, which was one of the big headline initiatives of the first Commission under Ursula von der Leyen, there is a sort of a growing sense among the European public that the costs of that transition, though the transition itself is necessary, the costs aren't being shared in an equitable way. And so you're seeing more and more contestation around the how, not the whether, to do the green transition. For me, where consensus, if we can call it that, or I think I would prefer to think of the idea of continued progress on decarbonisation within Europe will come from, is self-interest, because we're living in a world which is framed very much by transactionalism, by the sort of the Trumpian approach of nation first, thinking about relationships on an issue by issue basis. And when it comes to the choices which European countries need to take for the green transition, these are things that make sense economically in a world which is decarbonising. Europe is no longer on the front foot as it was at the beginning of the European Green Deal with the sort of first mover advantage, but it is now competing with other economies which are moving forward in this direction for resources, to get ahead in tech, to develop products in a way which are competitive, not only just on price, but in terms of respect for carbon pricing, which we're increasingly seeing sort of factored into economic thinking. So in this environment, the consensus on the need to keep moving down this path will come from the economic interest as much as the sort of the ideological need.
Well, thank you. I think it's a great opening. And speaking of the Green Deal, do you think it's that or is it just resting?
That's a nice phrase. I don't think it is. I don't think we're going to hear much talk about the Green Deal from either this European Commission or many of the national governments around the European Council table over the coming years. I think that actually in itself is problematic because it's sending a mixed signal to companies about the extent to which European governments are committed to it. But I think it is in the same way as we saw migration frame mainstream thinking after the 2015 refugee crisis within Europe. And we saw central sort of mainstream governments nervous about pursuing that proactively as an agenda. I think we know that we're in that space now with regards to the European Green Deal. And as a result, the framing of this commission is very much about competitiveness and security. As I said in my opening, these are things which are very much compatible with the objectives of the European Green Deal. But I think it will be under that banner that we will see the measures which need to be taken continue to move forward. But I also note that this is not necessarily a static picture. In terms of the Brussels politics over the last few weeks in the run-up to Ursula von der Leyen's State of the Union address, we saw a big pushback from the coalition which supported her election as president of the Commission a second time around. And so from the Renew Party, from the Liberals, from the Socialists, and from the Greens. And one of the elements of that, the sort of the overall framing was that she wasn't sticking to the promises that she'd made to that coalition. But the other element, one of the pieces of that was that around the green transition, that specifically there, the promises were being broken. So I think that sort of started to show you the extent to which it's not, it may no longer be a clean consensus around prioritizing the Green Deal, but there is no consensus either that it should be deprioritized. And a number of political groups feel quite strongly about that. And we're also starting to see that among national governments as well. So for example, the Danish presidency of the European Union has been pushing back quite hard about too purist an approach to the simplification agenda around regulation in the name of competitiveness, given that could mean that we lose certain elements of progress that we've made on the green transition. And I think increasingly with countries seeing more and more the impact of climate-related disasters in their member states, there is a sort of a growing minority within the European Council that are kind of questioning what we've come to understand as the green lash. And so we could start to see over the coming year a sort of a climate cleavage around the council table within European politics, whereby the kind of the new consensus as it was put forward is being overturned.
So you mentioned Greenlash, and I think it's important to understand the nature of this phenomenon because it's not just happening in the US ruled by Trump or countries ruled by anti-EU, anti-green politicians, but it seems to be a phenomenon happening all around Europe and transforming EU policy. Why do you think, with so many disasters, climate-related disasters, we still see this green lash happening and influencing EU policy?
I think for me, it's a question of limited resources as the European public sees it. So when you look at public opinion polling, almost everywhere across the EU, the top of list of citizens' concerns is cost of living. But increasingly, the broader geopolitical security environment looms very large as well. Climate change is there. but it normally kind of comes through, depending on the country, somewhere around sort of fifth or sixth place in terms of the things that they're most worried about. And so I think if you take that understanding that what people are looking for is economic growth to drive an improvement in living standards, which they're not seeing at the moment, and Europeans increasingly are pessimistic about the idea that the next generation is going to live more comfortably than the current generation. So that sort of pessimism looms through. I think that in that environment, they're clear-eyed about the fact that we have to make choices. So where I think that there's been a failure of the political narrative, because that's totally right. Of course, we do have to make choices with public spending, but where I think there's been a failure of the political narrative is in making the case that, in fact, the choices which we make to decarbonise make good economic sense, that green growth can deliver improvements in living standards, that this can be about dignity as well, and sort of increasing consumer choices in terms of transport, in terms of reliability of their energy supply in Europe, which is surrounded by a volatile geopolitical environment, with regards to keeping the costs of heating homes affordable, or indeed, as is the bigger concern in parts of southern Europe now, keeping homes cool during the summer months. And so I think that is where European policymakers need to do more work to show that it isn't either or, and that that decarbonisation is part of the bigger security and competitiveness package.
So that's I think it's a good transition towards your home country, to Britain. I wanted to ask you about the rising energy prices, because people being alarmed as households has the bills rising by, well, a couple of percentage points. But since Britain is, like, I think, just shut down its last coal power plants recently, it's I think for many people it was an example of successful transition towards renewables. Yet energy prices are rising, I think, unexpectedly. What is the explanation?
Well, in the UK case, for why energy prices are rising.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. So I think here what we need to look at is the sort of the longer term picture around the security of renewable energy that is being built up. And indeed, the UK has been relatively front-footed with regards to certain forms of renewable, particularly wind, offshore wind, and has been part of the development of nuclear-based energy and so on. But I think that what we're facing in the UK at the moment is a crisis around the ability to build up those long-term resources, which is perpetuating an ongoing reliance on the import of other sources. And so I think that for me, this is where Europe's green transition and in this specific case, the UK's green transition is deeply interconnected with its foreign policy relationships with other countries. Its ability to build partnerships, because the kind of the cost savings develop when there are economies of scale, when projects are developed at multi-country level in order to sort of to share technology, to safeguard the supply of the resources and minerals that are needed in order to move the clean tech forward. and I think that to some extent the UK has suffered from a sort of a period of relative isolation post Brexit in terms of the thinking around it. I think that is changing, and since 2022 we've seen growing cooperation on the security dimension with European countries around support for Ukraine and so on, feeding through into cooperation in other areas. And there is now a broader pan-European conversation, which the UK is much more connected to. But I think that we're seeing a sort of a certain lag coming through in part because of the fact that the UK has sort of chosen to pull itself out of the international cooperation around this picture.
So speaking of connections, I want to link to conclusion of the Power of Partnerships, your report, why Europe should engage more in the climate geopolitics and partnerships around the world. And you, in your conclusion, you write, I think you also mentioned this in this conversation, is that we have to acknowledge that there is increasingly transactional nature of international relations. And yet you recommend that EU can engage with the broad range of partners. So being transactional for a minute, what is it there for Europe in those potential partnerships? What is it in it for us?
So, I mean, I think what is in it for us is a very clear need that as Europeans we are not market leaders in terms of development and innovation in the clean tech space, and so at the moment we are importing quite a lot of the tech that we need for solar. Quite a lot of what we need for wind power and so on from the big Asian players in this sense. And so there is a certain amount of concern. This is making the sort of the argumentation too simple, that we are effectively swapping reliance in the fossil fuel era on Russia for energy for reliance on China, Taiwan, South Korea, and so on, in a clean tech era. That it's basically kind of swap one dependence for another kind of dependence. So we, in the paper with my colleague Matt Sennstrom, we argue that Europeans therefore need to diversify, take responsibility more for their own energy transition, and start to build up the partnerships which allow them to move tech development forward, which safeguards the access to the raw materials that they need for that, but also further up the supply chain as well in a broader set of relationships. And the paper builds on a series of dialogues that we set up between European thinkers and policymakers and counterparts in Latin America, a number of African countries. And what we could see there is appetite on both sides if it is framed in terms of the interest on both sides. And I think where the conversation is just about Europe importing critical raw materials, understandably from outside Europe perspective, that's not particularly attractive. But where the conversation is about building up partnerships around the development of new tech, where the conversation is about Europeans importing sort of further up the value chain than just simply the raw materials, and crucially giving access to European markets and respecting the sort of the free trading environment, which is so embattled at the moment with the trade war that Trump has inflicted on the world. I think that in that environment, many other partners can see a clear interest. And just to finish on that point, I think the other premise of this paper, which is important to keep in mind, is that just because Trump has moved the US away from the Paris Agreement, away from decarbonisation as a stated policy goal and so on, does not mean that the rest of the world has followed suit. I think that Europe's need in this area is very much understood and reflected in a range of other countries too. And so it's about sort of understanding that environment, understanding that complex picture, and being willing to invest in a broader range of partnerships around ensuring our own transition.
So I understand that even though US and China combined about 45% of global emissions, there are still incentives, even if it might not necessarily transform the perspectives for climates, but it still makes sense for EU and its partners to do these transitions anyway, right? That would be the conclusion of your report.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we are no longer in an age where Europe has America as a partner for pushing other major players such as China to take the need for them to reduce their emissions more seriously. But I think that Europe does still have a role to play in what we might call climate diplomacy, in driving this forward. But that has to be predicated on a clear and explicit commitment to its own green transition. And that is what is currently a little bit in question on the international stage at the moment, with the kind of the perceived step back of the second von der Leyen Commission and many other sort of member states around this agenda, and the willingness to kind of countenance in the trade talks, for example, with the US, Trump saying, well, if you just buy more gas, buy more oil from the US, then we can talk. I think that Europe needs to be more solid than that, but then it does have huge potential as a diplomatic actor in this space, as the largest single market, a player which is making choices which benefit other middle powers in terms of its own energy imports and so on, and so sort of using its transactional power, if you like, to the goal of climate diplomacy on the global stage, I think can still have an impact on other players, and ultimately it is about continuing to shift the needle towards emissions reduction, and continuing to show that this makes economic sense now and will continue to make economic sense in a world that is decarbonising. Europe has to play its part in that.
So I think closing down on this issue is: do you think that, for example, the politics seems to be the biggest obstacle? Do you think that building global partnerships and perhaps also introducing carbon tax or other measures which would sort of seize the green dumping, so the countries who are like China perhaps selling us the green technologies but without necessarily turning green themselves, do you think there are ways in which you can have your cake and eat it, so you can introduce green policies which would be global in scope but also beneficial to the main sorts of players within the EU and can actually be attractive policy again? Or do you think it has to be sort of enforced against the growing green lash which we observe around Europe?
My view is that we will not be able to enforce anything against the political will of, if there is no permissive consensus from the European public, then this is not something which policymakers will be able to drive forward. So for me, I would rather put it the other way around and say that it is the role of European decision makers to build that case in a way that demonstrates to the European public that the green transition remains part of achieving results on the things that they're worried about: cost of living, international security, and so on, and driving that forward. And if that kind of groundwork is done, then the big headline measures become possible on the international stage. And I think that we can achieve a place again where Europe is a driving force in the global green transition, even if it is no longer the kind of the first mover.
I think it's a great place to end. Susi Dennison, thank you so much for being with us today at Liberal Europe.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And if you like this conversation, I hope you can see Susi Dennison live at the Freedom Games, October 24, 26. I'll be there as well, and my co-host Ricardo Silvestre as well. So please tune in for him and for me in the next 2 weeks. Until then, goodbye.
You were listening to the Liberal Europe podcast by the European Liberal Forum. This podcast was co-financed by the European Parliament.